I feel like finding out this series was even going to happen, it's like the Great Conjunction. What's the Great Conjunction? Big change! Sometimes good, sometimes bad. We got the good version. The Dark Crystal, Age of Resistance. It's funny to me that this is going to come out like 4 days or so after I shoot it. I burned through this series in a weekend. That's not super uncommon for me. I've done that with stuff before, but usually with stuff that's shorter than this. Usually if I burn through something like that, it's usually, the half-hour shows. Something that's going to take me 5 hours tops altogether to watch. This is between 9 and 10 hours. So this is a bit for me to burn through as quickly as I did, and it should tell you quite a bit. The prequel to the cult classic film, The Dark Crystal. Now, I enjoyed The Dark Crystal quite a bit, with some reservations. You can see my review of the full thing from a little bit ago. But the short version is, I think the design of the original film is amazing. I think the puppetry is incredible. I think the world that is created is astounding. I think the storyline is pretty standard, heroic journey, epic fantasy kind of stuff. And I think Jen is quite possibly, at the very least, he's on the short list for a nomination for the most useless protagonist in the history of fantasy fiction. He's really, really just useless. There's no other word for him. I don't like Jen a lot at all. But so much else about it is so good. So it was definitely something worth revisiting. And I'm really, really glad they did. Now, I was nervous about the notion of a prequel for the same reason I'm always nervous about the notion of a prequel. How much of this is predetermined? How much do we already know how this is going to end? And there is a bit of that here, but it has an interesting outcome. And the first is that, really, if you think about The Dark Crystal, it's like the last chapter. Watching the original Dark Crystal is like reading the last few chapters of a book without having read anything that came before. You can infer a lot, you can get a lot from context, but you're like, I'm missing big chunks of this. It's not quite in media res. It does have a completed story arc, again, built around useless, but in terms of the world, it feels like there's so much you could be learning that you haven't. So it's a world that definitely lends itself to expansion, including from prior to the events of the Dark Crystal film. Because you can't really set much after. I mean, you could, but given the resolution, it's like, I feel like that should be the end. So a prequel in a lot of ways makes sense. That said, there are still the issues of, well, we know what the opening setup was for the film, which means there's some fairly significant things that are like, we kind of know where this is going to head. And normally that's more of a detriment. Here, it adds a certain vibe. It adds a certain melancholy to it that I think actually enhances the tone of the thing overall. And I won't go into huge detail on that, just on the off chance that, people have gotten into the show and haven't seen the movie yet. Like, I don't know if those people exist, but hey, maybe. I'm trying to be accommodating. So I'll avoid spoilers for as long as I can, as I usually try to do. So with your opening setup, we have the Skeksis in command of the crystal and of this world called Thra. It never got named in the. There's a number of things that didn't get named in the original film that get named, and those names get said a lot. It's actually one of the nitpicks I have. I feel like they look for way too many opportunities to say all the fantasy names like over and over and over and over again. But anyways, so we're here, and the Skeksis are in command of the crystal that is kind of for lack of a more elegant and detailed way to put it, it's basically the beating heart of this entire world. They're in control of it. It keeps them alive, but it's also become corrupted over time. Now, when I say they rule this world actively, like they are the rulers, the lords, and the other races, specifically the Gelflings, of which there are 7 clans, though we only really deal with 3 of them. We get a little bit of some of them, but primarily we're only dealing with 3 of the clans in this series. They serve. I mean, they are the subjects of the Skeksis. And it does create an interesting new dynamic where the Gelflings as a society don't realize that the Skeksis are a problem, at least not at the start of the thing. Of course, for us, the audience, A, if you've seen the movie, B, just look at them. Of course they're the bad guys. Holy crap. What else can you say? But we have that as a starting premise, and you basically deal with 3 different Gelfling protagonists in 3 different locations from each of the 3 main clans that we deal with, who sort of learn through different ways that the Skeksis are a problem. And they don't know each other, they're all in parallel, but eventually their stories have to converge, and then they have to try and build a resistance to what the Skeksis are actually doing. So there's a lot to like about this as a structure. First of all, the fact that we've got basically 3 primary protagonists, it means that instead of ending up with somebody incredibly bland, like Jen, who has to be kind of everything, they've gone for 3 more specific protagonist archetypes, but we get to have all 3. So we have Rian, who is, sort of the lighthearted guy. He's a fighter, but he doesn't take his duties all that seriously. He's actually a guard at the castle of the Skeksis, until something happens and he has his eyes open to what it is that he is in service of. He's like, oh, all right. So we've got that. We have Brea, who is very learned, she questions. That's her thing. She has questions. She always wants answers. And in her pursuit of generally just trying to find stuff out, she starts to put some things together that makes her realize, oh, crap. And then there is Deet. And Deet comes from this clan that lives underground. They're very connected to the world, to the earth, to Thra, to the various creatures. And she senses the corruption spreading. They call it the darkness. The darkening. Sorry, it makes me think of the Quickening and Highlander, and I can't help but snicker a little bit. But the darkening, and she becomes aware of that and basically sets out to try and figure out how to prevent the spread of this thing. And so you've got her working on more of the... Because she's literally lived her whole life underground, and she comes up, and so she's a bit more the fish out of water who is a little naive about the world. So you have, your slightly jaded character with Rian. You have your more naive character with Deet. You've got your middle ground with Brea. And like I said, different sort of archetypes for each of these 3 protagonists. And it balances really well between the 3 of them. I was fairly impressed with that. It's worth mentioning at this point, the voice cast is really good. Because it's quite a mix. We've got a fair number of people who basically get to play completely original characters, all the Gelflings, but we've got a number of people who also need to basically recreate in some way voice work from the film. And for me, the standout there is Simon Pegg voicing the Chamberlain. The Chamberlain's my favorite in this series. Of the Skeksis, he's so slimy and smarmy. And what I love about him more than anything is he's a manipulator. That's what he does. But at no point does the show or even the Chamberlain as a character try and sell him as sincere. Nobody believes that this guy is not always working his own agenda at all times. And yet he's able to convincingly mess with people despite that. There's a specific scene later on that I don't want to spoil, so I'll try and keep vague. He's talking to a character that is in his custody, and he actually flat out gives that character the chance to leave because there's concern this character that he has is going to try to escape, and he gives him the chance to leave and say, "Go ahead, run away, like you have been doing, and every time you do it, people die." And that cuts this other character to the core, and they don't run. And it's not that they don't know that the Chamberlain's manipulating them. They know. But man, he's good at it. I love him a lot. But so we've got all these, great recreations. And of course, the puppetry is astounding. And I'm going to highly recommend, if you watch this, you basically immediately leap into watching the making of documentary feature. It's about an hour, 20, hour and a half. Watch that because if nothing else, it'll open up your eyes to how little of this was CG. There's some obvious CG effects here and there, but if you watch the making of, you'll realize, some stuff that I had assumed was like heavily CG was actually just a little CG and still mostly puppets, which is freaking awesome. And I also, it's worth also mentioning with the Gelflings, I feel like they did a lot of nice little tweaking and redesign with the Gelflings a little bit. And apparently, to a certain degree, there's a little bit of CGI assistance to make them slightly more expressive, which is good because that was another kind of one of the slightly off things, again, mostly with Jen, not quite as much with Kira, in the original film, which was that the Gelflings, because they have a more human appearance, the fact that they move so stiffly feels a little more weird and a little more off-putting. That's not an issue with things like the Mystics, the Skeksis, the Podlings, because they don't look human. But the Gelflings are close enough that you notice how stiff they are. The movement is a little bit better in the face. You get a little bit more in the eyes. They have little tweaks to the mouth that are probably more than could have been done with animatronics. But not so much where it's suddenly like it feels like a superimposed mouth effect or anything like that. It's really well done. Incredibly subtly well done, and enough to give more life to the Gelflings as a species. And of the Gelfling characters, they're all pretty good. Rian, he's probably the most generic for me. Brea's pretty good. Deet's my favorite out of the Gelflings. I like her a lot. We also get a lot of fun side characters. Again, voiced by some terrific actors. We have a very fun sort of elder mystic kind of Gelfling character voiced by Eddie Izzard, which I had a lot of fun with. And there's some later voices that turn up that I can't even really say who the characters are because it's spoilers. I might have to start getting into spoilers. Look, if you enjoy all-encompassing fantasy, like complete fantasy world, no humans, no nothing, just dwell in this amazing world for a while, watch this. The story is a lot, I would say, significantly better than The Dark Crystal. Again, when I say the story, I don't mean the setting and the characters and the lore, I mean the narrative. It's got a lot more going on than the very straightforward hero's journey story that was the original film. So that's a nice thing as well. I am going to start getting into spoilers because I want to start talking specific things here and there. And like I've got little niggles and little nitpicks that I'll probably mention in the spoiler section, but like they weren't enough to even slow me down watching this thing. I enjoyed the ever-loving heck out of it. So, getting into spoilers a little bit. One of my more substantive complaints, because I've got little nitpicky things, like one of the CGI things that they do is they have the tongues waggle in the Skeksis' mouths. And I don't necessarily have a problem with them doing it, but they do it too much. And maybe I wouldn't feel that way if I wasn't so familiar with the original film where their tongues did not move like that. And if I didn't have that for reference, maybe it wouldn't bug me. But it does for this, that they open their mouths and the tongues just all over the place. That was an added CGI touch that I don't think was necessary, and for me didn't help. So there's little things like that. But the most substantive sort of thing is Aughra. Now, Aughra was my favorite character in the original film. And while they by no means wrecked her character or did anything like that. She's very true to the characterization we see in the original film. I don't really like the character's use and the character's role in the story. Now, I'm not going to say that they like got it wrong, because a big part of the original Dark Crystal is, if you're a big fan of that, you're dealing with a lot of headcanon, because we get so few concrete details about what this world was before. But my read on Aughra, and a big part of what I always liked about her, was that she's a little bit nuts, but she happens to understand what is going on overall in this world probably better than anybody else. That's been taken a bit further in this prequel, where now she's Mother Aughra, who basically was the guardian of the planet, and she's a much more active force, and I don't like that as much. I liked her a bit more being just... She wasn't an active... or I always read her as not being an active participant in what was going on, but basically the only one with the most pieces of the puzzle to understand what it was. She was an observer. She wasn't a player. And making her as active a participant as this does, I'm kind of like, oh, okay. It's not bad. It's just to what I liked about the character, it doesn't play into, sort of my memory, my vision, my preference for her. But that's me, and I have a feeling I'm probably going to be the only human being on the planet with that particular complaint. Then again, I don't know. I feel like every time I say that, other people are like, oh no, me too. So maybe there's a couple of us. I don't know. They did some really interesting things, because they played interestingly with the fact that we know all these gelflings are going to die. That's kind of what I mentioned at the front end, being the foreknowledge, giving it a sense of melancholy. And I found myself debating, would this play better if I didn't know from the movie that this resistance was going to fail? And it actually doesn't play better or worse, it just plays different. It's more hopeful if you don't know that. But I think the story still has resonance. It just shifts into being a bit more of a, man, this is gonna hurt kind of a thing. But it seems to have enough self-awareness to not try and really sell it as a true triumph. It has that undercurrent of melancholy, which, like with what happens with Deet at the end of the show, kind of helps reinforce as a general mood. So that helps feed off the general vibe of the thing. We got some really... They had a lot of fun playing with Skeksis that we hadn't seen, because well, in some cases we know, but presumably they're all dead at the start of the film. So we have characters like the Heretic and the Collector. I'm going to use their titles, because I mentioned before about them overusing the fantasy names. The names of the Skeksis is a good example of that. I will always think of them by their roles, not their names. So how often some of their names got said annoyed me. So for me, they're the Scientist, the Chamberlain, the Emperor, the Gourmand, the General. They're those. They're not Skeklak or Skekmail or, no. But anyways, we got to see some Skeksis who we'd never seen before, because they're dead. So we get the Heretic, we get the Hunter. And I figured what was going to go with the Hunter, especially when we got introduced to the Archer. I'm like, okay, so they're paired off. They're both going to die. The Heretic was quite a cool idea. I thought that was quite interesting. I suppose theoretically he doesn't have to be dead. Him and his... mystic other half, because they're so isolated, they just wouldn't be around. So that, I suppose that's feasible in that case. But also they sort of twisted, because I had assumed the General was the same one who ends up succeeding the Emperor in the film, the one that the Chamberlain has the trial by stone with. But it's not, because he dies. And that was a really cool reversal. And also had my single favorite moment of the whole thing, which is the Chamberlain stabbing him and going up and going, "You took my seat." Oh, God, I love him so much. Of course I love him. He's the single most Slytherin character on the entire show. Of course I love him. The Emperor was also interesting because obviously we only just saw him enough for him to die and scar me for life by seeing that when I was a kid. I mentioned before how the image of the Emperor in that film, that freaked me out as a kid and it still gives me the willies. He's just, he's so sick and... Anyways, it's interesting to get to know him. And Jason Isaacs, obviously that's great casting for the voice on that. Hup. Hup is probably my second favorite character. First of all, I love that we finally have a podling who is characterized as opposed to just, the podling, I actually think, were they before? They would have been made around the same time. Not enough that one could be accused of being a ripoff of the other, but the podlings feel very reminiscent of the Ewoks in the original film. But to have one well characterized and to have ambitions and to have relationships and a full personality of his own in Hup, that's great, and I love him, and I think he's absolutely adorable. There is an underutilization of Fizzgigs in this. I'll say that for myself, but I know I have to say that for Liz because Fizzgig by far is like her favorite thing ever, and she was super excited when the first images of Bafi, which is the Fizzgig with the eye patch, came out, and she's, at the time I'm recording this, she's still working her way through the show, and I've finished, and I'm like, oh, man, she's gonna like this, but the first thing she's gonna tell me is there was not enough Fizzgig in this, and she'll also be right. But the second episode, two Fizzgigs barking at each other. That was my favorite thing I didn't know I needed. In this world is so fully realized, and everything is so complete. You feel like you're witnessing entire ecosystems and now an entire civilization with the Gelfling, which we didn't have before. We knew the Skeksis, we knew the Mystics, we knew Jen, Kiera, and a little bit about the Podlings, but we've got this entire 7-clan community we knew nothing about before. I really, really do hope this gets a second season. But even if it doesn't, because I have no doubt this was very expensive to make. And even if it doesn't get a second season, where it left is probably a good, will probably work and function, but I really want to see what else there is. I want to see what other tricks this has up its sleeve. I want to find out a bit more about what's going on with Deet. I want to see the Chamberlain keep scheming. I want to see the Gartham put to work. I want more time. I want more time in this world. And I've always wanted more time in this world. But you know what? I now have 10 more hours worth of time in this world that I didn't have before. And it is clearly made by people with passion who love the original and we're so excited to be doing this. And it's not retreading. It's not about trying to recapture what the original was. It is trying to bring whole new life and whole new elements to it. They're not reinventing the wheel. They are taking the wheel and just building the craziest friggin' vehicle you've ever seen out of it. Does that analogy even work? I don't know. It's a little late. I'm a little tired, but this was really, really good. And if you haven't seen it, I hope you don't care about spoilers because we're in the spoiler section at this point. But if you have seen it, what did you think about it? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. There's a bunch of stuff to do down there as well. You can support me on Patreon and help keep this channel going, help me pay my bills. Even $1 a month helps, honestly. A bunch of other stuff below that besides my social media links and my book if you want to buy that and all sorts of stuff. So go on down, give it a click. Or don't. I am not going to tell you what to do. Because at the end of the day, you're the council. I'm just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned.